Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we're going to dive into a long video today. This is the 50 greatest historical events that never happened. So, in other words, they're not historical events. And I guess the point of this video, I'm supposing, is that it's going to debunk some historical myths. Some of those things that people believe to be true, a story maybe you heard growing up, or maybe you were even taught in school that really has no basis in fact. So we'll probably break this up into a couple of parts. We'll see how far I get. Depends on how much I talk, I guess, how far we get today. And we'll just make this a multiple part series, maybe 2 or 3 parts in total. The link is in the description, as always, so you can check it out without my commentary. This is on the channel Sideprojects, who I believe this is another one of Simon Whistler's many channels. They've got 994,000 subscribers, so they're getting super close to 1 million. Hopefully we'll see them get pushed over that amount real soon. I want to thank my friend Kieran for being a longtime supporter through Patreon. Appreciate that. Kieran and I finally got to meet a couple of months ago in Gettysburg when he came out. I guess it was actually just about a month ago. Came out for the Gettysburg Film Festival. So great to meet you, Kieran. Hopefully we'll get to meet again down the road sometime. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
There have been thousands of years of recorded history full of incredible stories. However, many of the most entertaining anecdotes may never have happened at all. Often, these stories first began circulating as fact well after the people involved were dead, meant as a way to emphasize a particular character trait of that individual. Others used entirely fictional people to illustrate a particular point that the speaker wanted to get across. Today we'll be diving into 50 apocryphal tales, looking at some of the most famous and memorable stories from throughout history that may or may not have actually transpired.
So just before we get into this, because I have no idea what the specifics are going to be of this, I would just anticipate a couple of things. Number one, some of these are probably just flat out fabrications, like there's no truth to them whatsoever. Others may have some basis in truth, and maybe they got embellished over time. And there may be some that actually did happen, but we just don't have any real proof of it. I mean, because what is proof, after all, when we're talking about an event that happened hundreds or even thousands of years ago, when our only record of it may be one person writing stuff down, who may have been biased, who may not have been a first-hand source, who may have made it up, who may have twisted it, who may have had some purpose. And so honestly, some of these, there's just no way to know for sure because we don't have video of these events. In some cases, you might have multiple eyewitnesses, but it's hard to say. So we'll see.
George Washington the Cherry Tree. When George Washington was 6 years old, he was given a hatchet as a present by his father. As he was still a young child, Washington went out to play with his new toy, chopping at various things. While running around, Washington came across a cherry tree and struck it multiple times with his hatchet. He did not fully cut down the tree, but he damaged it enough that it wound up dying as a result. After seeing that his favorite cherry tree had been killed, Washington's father angrily confronted him, demanding to know what had happened to the tree. Washington replied, "I cannot tell a lie, father. You know I cannot tell a lie. I cut it with my little hatchet." Rather than being punished, the young George Washington was praised for his honesty. It's a great story about the bravery and integrity of the first American president, and it almost certainly never happened. The story was invented by Mason Locke Weems, a traveling bookseller and the author of the first biography written about Washington. The former president had died in 1799, and Weems published his book the following year in 1800. It was an instant success, but the story wasn't even originally included. Weems didn't add the apocryphal tale until the 5th edition of the book in 1806, meaning it was almost certainly just a piece of fiction. Today's episode.
So this is one of those ones that I would chalk up to it could have happened and we just don't have any proof, but there's certainly nothing to keep that from being a true story. But yeah, you have to chalk it up to there's no way we can know for sure if it actually happened, if the first record of it comes in a book that was written after his death. Listen, something I say all the time, I'm really I give the side eye to anybody who writes something after all of the people who could refute it are gone. There's a great example of this. There's a very modern story going around about the nature of Alvin York's Medal of Honor action outside of Chateau Chehery during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And there's a modern book that's been written by a guy who kind of refutes the official story and says that Alvin York really, it was all embellished and it was made up because America needed a hero and all these sorts of things. And this, I'm getting way off track, but there's a couple of problems with that for me. One is the guy only now writes the book when these events happened 100 years ago. All the people who were involved are long gone. And so anytime somebody comes along 100 years after the event, an event that's been well documented over that 100 years, and says, I have all new evidence that proves everything else you've learned is wrong, I got a big problem with that. Unless something very compelling comes to light. If they're just looking at the same evidence everybody else had, but have a new spin on it and say everybody else is wrong, it bothers me. And that happens a lot throughout history. And so some of these are probably going to fall into that category.
George Washington and the silver dollar. Next, let's look at another story about Washington that may have more of a basis in reality. He was an active and athletic man, and it's often reported that he took part in the common pastime of distance throwing. This has led to superhuman descriptions of his strength, including a feat in which Washington threw a silver dollar clear across the Potomac River, or possibly the Delaware River. These stories are impossible exaggerations, as the silver dollar didn't exist until Washington was in his 60s, and the Potomac is over a mile wide. However, the original story
it does depend entirely on where you are on the Potomac River. If you're down by like Mount Vernon, it's super wide. You go up more to its source and it's going to be smaller. The Mississippi's the same way. The Mississippi River in New Orleans is a completely different animal than the Mississippi River in Minnesota. I drove over this little creek when I was in, I think, Grand Rapids, Minnesota, and I remember looking at it and thinking, I wonder what body of water that was. It was the Mississippi River. I could have almost jumped across it at that point. That's part of it. But the silver dollar not existing is a little more difficult.
From his step-grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. According to the grandson, it was
by the way, George Washington Parke Custis, so he is the grandson of Martha Washington from her first husband. She was married once before, had 2 children, a daughter and a son. The daughter died they actually both died as teenagers. Daughter died she had a seizure. And Jack Custis, the son, died when he was with George Washington in Yorktown during the final campaign that ended with the surrender of Cornwallis. But Jack, by that point, had this son, George Washington Parke Custis, who is the father of the woman who would become Mrs. Robert E. Lee. And he's also the one for whom the Custis Lee Mansion is named in Arlington. And George Washington adopted him as like an adopted son.
Piece of slate, roughly the size of a silver dollar that Washington had thrown, and that it was a narrow part of the Rappahannock River near Washington's childhood home, with some parts of the river.
Yeah, so George Washington was born right near Fredericksburg.
150 feet, this was much more plausible, though still very impressive. In 1936, the legend was put to the test by Baseball Hall of Famer Walter Big Train Johnson to celebrate Washington's 204th birthday. Johnson was taken to a part of the river estimated to be 380 feet across and given 3 attempts. The first fell just short of the opposite bank, and the second barely crossed the river. Not wanting to disappoint, Johnson threw the third coin clear over the heads of some 2,000 spectators on the opposite side of the river. The historic memento was then retrieved by Peter Yon. When questioned by reporters what he intended to do with the coin, Yon replied, "I cannot tell a lie. I'm going to sell it to the highest."
That's fantastic. Most people, if you've ever been around a river growing up, you've probably tried to skip rocks. That's always kind of a fun thing. And you can skip, like you find the right kind of rock and throw it at just the right angle. You can get that thing to bounce 5, 6, 7 times on the river and go really far. So I can see something like a silver dollar. You get the right spin on it and get a good throw on it. You could really send that thing flying.
It's bitter. Nero fiddled while Rome burned.
There was no fiddle back then.
Nero is known for being a cruel emperor, and there is the off-sided anecdote that he fiddled while Rome burned. It is true that Nero cared more about his own musical and artistic endeavors than he did about the welfare of the Roman people. Though if there was any truth to this story, Nero would have been playing the lyre rather than the fiddle. The story is often attributed to Roman historian Tacitus, though he never actually made this claim. According to Tacitus and many other sources, Nero was 35 miles away when the Great
Right.
Fire of Rome broke out, and he quickly returned to help coordinate the relief efforts. However, Tacitus did insinuate that Nero may have orchestrated the fire, and that he used it for his own benefit by building his grand palace in the area that the fire had devastated. It's unclear what the origin of this apocryphal tale was, but the intent was clear: to portray Nero as a heartless and indifferent leader, more interested in himself than in the subjects he was supposed to be ruling over. It's certainly not an unfair characterization of the Roman emperor, even if this story didn't happen.
Yeah, so that's a perfect example of one of those stories we know couldn't have happened, first of all, because the fiddle didn't exist yet. Second of all, because all the reliable sources say Nero wasn't in the city when the fire broke out. This is more about, like he said, portraying the kind of callousness that Nero had and the fact that he took advantage of the aftermath of this. First of all, he blames it on Christians. And so that's one of the first kind of persecution of Christians that happens. This is probably when the apostles Paul and Peter were executed during this persecution. But he wasn't throwing massive amounts of Christians to the lions. He did crucify some and light them on fire and make them into torches for dinner parties, things like that. That's all pretty much confirmed to be true. But and Nero ends up having to take his own life because his own people turn on him. But yeah, that's just one of those stories that was invented to show who he was.
Zeno's paradoxes of motion. The Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea is famous for his motion paradoxes. The argument states that which is in locomotion must arrive at the halfway stage before it arrives at its goal. That certainly makes sense and seems to be obviously true, but Zeno used this paradox to argue that all motion was impossible. Now say you want to run a mile. Before you can finish the mile, you must run half a mile, but before you can finish the second half mile, you must run a quarter of a mile, then an eighth, a 16th, and so on. The remaining distance can be divided in half an infinite number of times, so the runner must complete an infinite number of tasks before arriving at the destination. Because a person cannot complete infinite tasks in a finite amount of time, Zeno argued that it was impossible to ever reach a destination. Using the same arguments on the front end of the journey, he also argued that it was impossible for a person to start moving as well, and thus all motion was an illusion. In his writings, the Greek philosopher Simplicus wrote,
"This is one of those examples of somebody just saying stuff that sounds really complex and interesting and smart, but means absolutely nothing."
Hearing Zeno's argument, the aptly named Diogenes the Cynic stood up and walked around disproving the idea that motion was impossible. Of course, this story almost certainly never happened. Zeno was only about 11 years old when Diogenes died, and Simplicus was writing about it several centuries later. But true or not, it was a fantastic mic drop moment for Diogenes. Behold a man. Diogenes' alleged antics didn't end with Zeno. This entire episode could probably be filled with apocryphal stories of Greece's most hilariously antagonistic philosopher, but we'll stick with just one more for now. What it means to be human was of great interest to the ancient Greeks, and interest in that question never really went away. This was not only the subject of many philosophical debates, but of scientific debates as well. Plato sought to create a scientific definition of what a man was, and settled on declaring that humans were defined as featherless bipeds. It's not a terrible definition, as only humans and birds are bipedal, so this combination was rather uniquely human. Upon hearing this definition, Diogenes went home and plucked all the feathers off of a chicken. He then attended Plato's next lecture, and when Plato repeated his definition, Diogenes held up the bald chicken, declaring, "Behold, a man." Plato amended his definition.
Okay, that's pretty good. I've never heard this before.
With broad, flat nails, seemingly missing the entire point of Diogenes' criticism. As popular as this story is, it doesn't appear in any ancient Greek texts. We can just hope that Diogenes was really as entertaining as all the apocryphal stories make him out to be.
Maybe that was one of the things that was in the Library of Alexandria that we lost.
Detachable shirt collars. In the late 1700s, high collars for men were all the rage. The higher and stiffer the collar a man had, the more wealthy and important he must be.
Imagine how ridiculous some of our fashions are going to look to people a couple hundred years from now.
While many people today would consider this somewhat ridiculous trend to be a fashion crime, it wasn't actually a victimless crime. Those collars needed to be washed and starched each time they were worn, and this task became one of the many jobs of irritated wives. One man's wife allegedly became so annoyed with the whole situation that she decided to do something about it. After a week of work, the husband would have 5 shirts that were perfectly clean except for the collars, and she would have to spend time washing and starching them all. Fed up with washing clean shirts, she cut the collars off of her husband's shirts, washing and starching them separately, as a way to save time. This is the claimed origin of detachable shirt collars, which became an entire industry starting in the 1820s. No name is ever given for this woman, so the entire story was likely invented as a marketing tactic to get women to encourage their husbands to buy these collars.
That makes sense, but at some point somebody had to have come up with the idea. Whether it happened that way or not, somebody came up with that idea at some point somewhere.
Judgment of Solomon. The Judgment of Solomon is one of the most famous ancient stories,
What's from the
constantly
Bible?
being referenced and parodied throughout pop culture. In the story, two women who lived in the same house went before Solomon along with an infant child. Both women had given birth at around the same time, but one of the children had died in its sleep. They each claimed that the surviving baby was theirs and asked Solomon to rule on the matter. Solomon called for his sword and declared that the child would be cut in half, with each woman receiving half a baby. One woman agreed to this judgment, saying that if she couldn't have the baby, then no one could have it. The other begged Solomon to spare the child's life and just give it to the other mother. Solomon declared that the latter woman was the true mother, as a mother would do anything to save the life of her child, even if it meant giving it up. The story first appeared in the Book of Kings. As we previously discussed on this channel, much of that particular book of the Bible is a reasonably accurate chronicle of Jewish history. However, while there is a small amount of archaeological evidence suggesting King Solomon did exist, the biblical stories of his reign are regarded as being far more embellished than most of the Book of Kings.
This is one of those ones, and obviously I am seeing all of this through my bias as a Christian who also went to school for Bible and theology. But this falls into the category of it just depends on whether you trust the source or not. It was obviously written down. It was obviously written down a long time ago, within a few hundred years of the events that they portray, if not sooner. We know for sure that this stuff was written down probably at the latest 400 or 500 years after the time of Solomon, but it could go back to much sooner, and it could be based on something that happened during his reign that was written down then. But most scholars date a lot of the Old Testament to that exile period, 400, 500, 600 BC. So it just depends on whether or not you trust the source, really.
This story likely never happened and was just a popular anecdote to demonstrate Solomon's wisdom. Albert Einstein failed maths. For generations, Einstein's early academic career has been a source of inspiration for those struggling in school as well as for the gifted but lazy underachievers. After all, everyone knows that Einstein failed maths as a child. Some versions of the story say it was because he had trouble understanding the material, and others say it was because he found it boring and just didn't care. But is there any truth to this famous story? No. Not at all. It's Albert Einstein. Do you really think that he failed mathematics? It's unclear exactly where this myth originated, but it was ubiquitous well before he died. In 1935, a rabbi at Princeton showed Einstein a newspaper article making this claim. He reportedly laughed and said, "Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus." The only kernel of truth of this story is that Einstein was a somewhat lazy student. He had very poor attendance during college, instead choosing to copy notes off one of his friends in the physics program. But despite this, he was still at the top of his class. The only poor grade Einstein seems to have received in any class was from one university professor who took a personal offense to how often he skipped class, despite him excelling on the exams.
So this is another one of those ones that it always bothered me why we feel like we have to make up stories like that when there are enough real examples that we could use to inspire people. If the idea behind saying, hey, Einstein failed math is to say, you know what, failing a class is not necessarily a full indication of someone's intelligence. There could be a lot of other factors. There are a lot of other examples you could use of that without having to make something up. It's the same thing with like when we start talking about all the comparisons between Kennedy and Lincoln, and people start talking about how many parallels there are between the two presidents and their assassinations. And there's a lot of really strange coincidences or just comparative things. But then people start making ones up that are completely untrue. Like there's one stupid one I see all the time where it says that a week before his assassination, Abraham Lincoln was in Monroe, Maryland, and a week before his assassination, JFK was in Maryland, Monroe. Well, Marilyn Monroe died in August of 1962, more than a year before JFK died. So sometimes people just make stuff up, and there's really no point to it.
2. Brute. On March the 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was surrounded and assassinated by around 40 Roman senators. After taking stock of his various attackers, he spoke his final words to one who was very close to him. Et tu, Brute. The story of Julius Caesar is inseparable from these famous last words, but Caesar never said this. The quote first appeared in William Shakespeare's play about Caesar.
This is the one trouble with Shakespeare, is that he was so iconic of a writer that some people have confused his plays about history with the actual history. So people think that Richard III shouted, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," on the Bosworth battlefield. And people think that Caesar said, "Et tu, Brute," or that Mark Antony said, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." Where all these events happened, not necessarily the words that are used. Caesar did. I have read some accounts, though, where he said something close to it, like "you too, my son," or something like that.
Not to say that it isn't somewhat based in reality, but there is debate among historians about Caesar's last words. When the attack began, Caesar said in Latin, "Ista quidem vis est," or "but this is violence." There are two common theories, both of which date back to at least the 2nd century AD. Some accounts claim those were his last words.
I've also seen some where they say, like, "what is this violence?" He was actually sitting in the chair that you see there. He was sitting in the chair when he was first stabbed, I think like up in the shoulder or something. And most of the guys who stabbed him didn't do a very good job. Like, they were superficial wounds or they missed altogether. And they think most of the stab wounds actually happened after he died. It was a wound to the groin that probably was the fatal wound. But like he initially, the guy who first attacked him, he said that, like, "what is this violence?" or, "but this is violence," something like that.
He said nothing further once the stabbing began. Others claimed that he then spoke the words, "you too, child," somewhat similar to the famous "et tu, Brute." However, if Caesar really did say those words, it's reported that he said them in Greek rather than in Latin. If he did say that, it's also unclear whether the comment was even directed at Marcus Brutus, or if it was meant to be for Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, who he referred to as being like a son to him, and who many believed was in fact his illegitimate child. Benjamin.
Interesting. There are also reports, if you've ever seen the portrayal of Caesar's assassination in HBO's Rome, it's a fairly good portrayal of what happened. It's not exact, obviously. There's liberties they take with it, but it's pretty close. And you see at the very end as he's dying, and incredibly acted by Kieran Hines, that whole role as Julius Caesar. He tries, like, in vain to pull his cloak up over his head, which is something that I've read in the reports from the assassination he did really try to do.
Benjamin Franklin's kite. In June 1752, Benjamin Franklin tied a key to a string and flew it during a thunderstorm. The key was struck by lightning, and thus Franklin discovered electricity. That's how the story was originally told, though more recently it's become common knowledge that people already understood the existence of electricity and that Franklin was merely trying to prove lightning was made up of electricity. Although the story is considered apocryphal, with many historians doubting its authenticity, the origin of this story is a letter written by Franklin himself. However, in the letter, Franklin merely described the experiment. He never stated when or even if he had actually conducted it. 15 years later, Joseph Priestley's book History and Present Status of Electricity recounted the tale, presumably with additional details provided to him by Franklin. While Priestley claims that Franklin and his son did conduct the experiment, there was no claim that the key was struck by lightning. If it had been, Franklin almost certainly would have died. We know this because others died while conducting lightning rod experiments described by Franklin. According to the book, the kite was drawn back down to the ground after flying in the storm, and Franklin felt an electrical charge on the key when he touched it. It had picked up ambient electrical charge in the air. Benjamin Franklin's national...
So interesting. And that's one of those ones that I think falls into the category of, are there really people who actually believe that one? But I guess there probably are. I'm just not sure how many.
Bird. It's tradition to eat turkey on Thanksgiving in the United States, but according to a popular story, this wouldn't be the case if Benjamin Franklin had his way. This story started to circulate in newspapers when the United States was celebrating its 100th birthday, and it was based on a letter that Franklin wrote to his daughter. In the letter, Franklin criticized the bald eagle, calling it lazy and of bad moral character. He went on to say that the turkey was a much more respectable bird, and withal a true original native of America. But while Franklin may have preferred the turkey to the eagle, he never nominated it to be the national bird, nor did he make any of these comments publicly. The context of the letter was to criticize the original design for the Great Seal of the United States, as he felt the design of the eagle made it look more like a turkey. This was what led to his tangent on avian morality. However, Franklin didn't want the turkey on the Great Seal either. He had been given the chance to design the seal several years earlier, and his proposed design featured neither an eagle nor a turkey, but rather Moses parting the Red Sea. What that had to do with the United States is anybody's guess, which is probably why it was rejected.
Yeah, so that's a great example of one that's like, huh? At least for me. I mean, I've heard the story about the turkey, but I don't know that I've ever heard that there was an actual proposal to make it the national bird. I mean, there's so much inspiration in the founding of the United States that you can see in the Roman Republic. So many of the ideas for the U.S. government come from the Roman and Greek republics. So much of even the design of our national monuments and our buildings come from Greek and Roman designs as well. And the eagle, of course, a very iconic Roman symbol. So I'm not surprised at all, especially because we have so many bald eagles here now. They were endangered for a while, but they're everywhere now. I see them all the time here where I live.
The Gordian Knot. When Alexander the Great set out on his conquest of Asia Minor, he had a legendary encounter with the Gordian Knot. In Gordium, in Phrygia, there was an extremely intricate knot connecting an ox cart to a post. The knot had been tied by King Gordius, a peasant who was declared king and became the foster father to the eventual King Midas. An oracle declared that any man who could untangle the elaborate knot would become ruler of all of Asia. When Alexander heard this story, naturally he wanted to untie the knot. According to the legend, he tried to untie the knot conventionally, but to no avail. He then reasoned that it didn't matter how the knot became undone, just that it did, so he pulled his sword out and cut the knot in half. Now, this is a fun story, demonstrating how seemingly complex problems can be easily solved with brute force, although that's not necessarily a great lesson, is it? But did it happen? Well, allegedly it sort of did. According to Greek historian Aristobulus, who accompanied Alexander on his campaign, they really did encounter the Gordian Knot. However, Aristobulus described a more clever solution devised by Alexander. Rather than cutting the knot in half, he stated that Alexander removed the linchpin from the yoke of the ox cart, freeing one end of the rope so that it could be easily untied. While this story is considered more plausible, it may still have been a piece of fiction designed by Aristobulus to legitimize Alexander's expansion of the Greek Empire. Columbus.
So that's another great example of just, do you believe the source? This guy was with Alexander. He's a first-hand witness to this stuff. It comes down to, do you believe that he really did see this or not? I find this one plausible just because it is a first-hand source, and it's just really any of these where we don't have multiple people from different perspectives writing about it, you're going to just chalk it up to, do I believe the source or not?
This proved the Earth was round. In 1492, Columbus dared to do the unthinkable and sail west to his inevitable doom. Everyone knew the Earth was flat, but Columbus was a brave and daring explorer who sought to prove them all wrong. But before they could even leave port, Columbus had to convince the ignorant and superstitious sailors that the Earth really was round. And of course, we all know this isn't true, and it's been well established since ancient times that the Earth is round. However, the origin of this myth is surprisingly interesting. It's often attributed to the 1828 biography of Columbus by Washington Irving, titled A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. Irving was a fiction writer, and this supposed biography...
He's the guy who wrote the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He's actually buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in New York, up the Hudson River from New York City. The Headless Horseman, that whole thing.
Was a heavily fictionalized and unrealistic retelling of history. But while this book perpetuated the myth that people in the Middle Ages believed that the Earth was flat, it was part of a much larger trend. This began in the 1600s as a coordinated effort by Protestants to disparage Catholic teaching. In the 1800s, the myth became extremely widespread, thanks to both revisionist histories, like Irving's book, as well as an increasing belief that science and religion had been extremely antagonistic in the Middle Ages. The latter belief completely ignored the fact that many scientists were also members of the clergy. Columbus's ships.
Yeah, people forget that. I mean, guys like Einstein, for example, were Christians. There was a degree of, Galileo is a perfect example. a guy who is at odds with the church, and by the church in this case it was the Catholic Church, because of the idea of a heliocentric solar system. In other words, that the Earth revolved around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the Earth. But yeah, like he said, I think this is one that there are probably a lot of people who grew up believing, but I feel like we've done a fairly good job of getting the word out that it's baloney, and that not only did we know for millennia by that point that the Earth was round, but that we had a fairly good idea of how big the Earth was, too.
While we're on the topic of Columbus, children across the United States have learned for centuries that he sailed to America on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. However, those were not actually the names of the three ships. Ships at the time were almost invariably named after saints, so while the Santa Maria is correct, the other two names were not. Sailors would normally give nicknames to boats, which is what the names Nina and Pinta would have been. Pinta was Spanish for painted one, and Nina was Spanish for little girl. We know that the Nina's real name was the Santa Clara, but the actual name of the Pinta is unknown. Catherine the Great's death. Catherine the Great was Russia's longest reigning empress and accomplished a great deal during her time on the throne. However, one of the things she was most known for was the many lovers she took as empress. Catherine would invite a man to be with her until she got bored of him, at which point she would give him some land, serfs, and a pension and send him on his way. This led to a lot of rumors and urban legends, the most famous of which was about Catherine's cause of death. According to the tale, Catherine was engaging in amorous activities with her favorite horse, the harness that was suspended.
I've known the story about the horse, which I don't think anybody takes seriously. I didn't know it was connected to a story about her death.
The horse broke, and the horse crushed Catherine to death. Although this apocryphal tale began circulating immediately after her death and persisted for centuries, it was nothing but slander. Catherine actually...
I was going to say, this is a classic example of wanting to badmouth someone after they're gone by telling lewd stories, by taking an element of truth, which is that she liked to sleep around, and making it into something even nastier.
She died from a stroke, and the story about her horse was one of many salacious rumors started by her political enemies to discredit the empress.
Yeah.
The Salting of Carthage. The Third Punic Wars took place between Rome and Carthage from 149 BC through 146 BC.
And this is the war that basically ends Carthage as a legitimate power in the Mediterranean.
Although the siege of Carthage took 3 full years, the Romans were eventually successful in their mission, but it wasn't enough to win. They had to send a message. To that end, the Roman general Scipio Alamanus razed all the buildings in the city and sowed the ground with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Or so the story goes, and it was a pretty believable one. There are many ancient references to salting the earth, and the salting of Carthage is among the most famous, second only to the biblical account of the salting of Shechem. However, while ancient sources do mention this practice, it is unclear how often it actually happens. When it did, it was likely a small symbolic gesture, possibly meant to place a curse on the conquered lands. Actually salting the ground to prevent agriculture, which would have required massive amounts of salt, would have been prohibitively expensive. And
I was just thinking, you need that salt, and salt's a finite resource that you're going to want to take advantage of. And if you're conquering Carthage, you probably want that land to be profitable for you.
A logistical nightmare. However, it's unlikely that this happened to Carthage even in a symbolic fashion. While Scipio did raise Carthage and the Romans were intent on the city remaining in ruins, there are no ancient references to the salting of Carthage. The first book about the Third Punic War to include this detail wasn't written until the 19th century. Because the practice was believed to be common in ancient times, it's believed that the author added the detail simply to make the story more interesting in a plausible way.
Yeah.
Historian.
That's a great example of one we can pretty much write off as not being true. If none of the ancient sources mentioned it, and this is another one of those examples like I mentioned earlier where somebody comes along long after all the other sources and says, I have new information that nobody else had, it's probably baloney.
Of the past, everybody. Stockbrokers jumping out of windows. The 1920s was a great time to be in the stock market. The market was experiencing a speculative bubble, inflating stock prices to completely unreasonable heights. However, as investors were reminded in the years 2000, 2008, 2015, and 2018, to name just a few, these speculative bubbles always burst. In October of 1929, the first stock market crash began. Between Black Monday and Black Tuesday, the market dropped over 23%. This was not an isolated incident, and the market had already been in sharp decline, but it remains the largest two-day drop in history. People were panicked, and stockbrokers began jumping out of windows to end their own lives as they crashed headfirst into Wall Street, just like their stocks had. It was even said that there were lines of brokers waiting for a free window.
And there's even stories like this in fiction. If you've seen the movie Titanic, that's how the story of one of the major roles in Titanic, they say that he put a gun in his mouth after the stock market crash.
Was the initial reporting in newspapers, and comedians quickly jumped onto the story to help perpetuate the rumors. However, there is not a single verified instance of this actually happening. While the Great Depression did see higher suicide rates than the 1920s had, there was no sudden spike in October of 1929. Most people accepted that the world had gone to chose to do their best to survive. The stockbrokers never jumped out of the window. Let them eat cake. Marie Antoinette was the last queen of France before the French Revolution, and the revolution did not end well for her or her husband, King Louis XVI. They were both beheaded after an angry populace removed them from power.
Although it happened at different times, they weren't beheaded at the same time. Hers came much later.
Stories of Marie Antoinette, none is more famous than when she was informed that the peasants had no bread to eat. She was reported as saying, "Let them eat cake." However, there's no evidence that she actually ever said this, nor is it even a proper translation of the quote people have attributed to her, though the sentiment is largely the same. In French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's autobiography, he made reference to an unnamed princess who, upon hearing that the peasants had no bread, replied, "Qu'ils mangeaient de la brioche." This translates to "let them eat brioche," which is
And I think Marie Antoinette was still like a kid when this was written.
A fancier, sweeter bread, but still, it's a bread, it's not cake. However, while not published until 1782, Rousseau is said to have completed the book in 1767, 3 years before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France. In reality, stories like this had existed for centuries in different languages all across the world. It was just a joke meant to show how out of touch the ruling class were with the people over who they were supposed to be ruling.
So that's a great example of a phrase that did appear in writing that people would have been familiar with from Marie Antoinette's time, but that was attributed to her to make her to describe what people thought of her as being this out of touch, doesn't care about people, doesn't even understand the plight of the poor, and could have been applied to any number of people at that time. It just happened to have been applied to her in that case. And that's definitely probably one that, why do I say that all the time? Definitely, probably. That's definitely one of those ones that I think a lot of people have believed over time. They've just accepted as being true because it seems to fit and it seems to make sense that she would have said something like that, even though there's no evidence that she did. So we're going to wrap it up right there. We are a little over a third of the way through this. We'll come back tomorrow with some more, and we'll work our way through from 19 till however far we get. We'll see. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Thanks for watching.